Well, greetings. I want to talk today about after final practice. So I've recorded a video about RCEs, and I don't like RCEs. And so you might think after final practice, that's easy. You just appeal because that's what I like the best. And I explained various reasons for that in my other video. But I didn't really talk in the other video. I mean, that was all about sort of preparing yourself for getting to the point where you're at a final rejection. And now I'm going to say, all right, you got it, final rejection in hand, now what? And I want to talk about three things. One is that RCE. What do you do, right? The other one is little unreliable, but I think it's worth mentioning trying to get a new examiner. And the third is my favorite, which is appeals. And I want to talk a little bit about the mechanics of writing them. So let's start with RCEs. These are a pain, but you might be in a position where you end up filing them. Let me give you an example. So you have a final rejection. You think it's terrible. You interview with the examiner. And the examiner says, oh, you know what? You're right. Why don't you make this little change in the claims? Because I agree with all your arguments. I agree this is good. You couldn't have an interview with the examiner earlier before the final for, scheduling reasons, something happened. But now you've had the interview, and the examiner says, hey, I totally agree with you. You're right. But I don't think your arguments really come through in the claims. So make this little change. Well, you might end up having to file an RCE to make that change. It always makes me nervous to do that because, little changes like that, in theory, right, I'd rather, if I can, get the examiner to do as an examiner's amendment or enter it through like AFCP 2.0. But, maybe you do have to file an RCE. So the question is, what's the best way to do this? Well, okay, if you're going to file the RCE, I'm going to say you have two options. Option number one is you file the RCE. Option number two is you try and submit it, not as an RCE, but as an amendment after final. Now, earlier in my career, I felt amendments after final were largely a waste of time. And the reason they were largely a waste of time is because the examiner would almost invariably, in fact, I'm trying to think, I've gotten some things through using the FCP 2.0 program, but I can't think of a time when I've actually had an amendment after final, just straight amendment after final work. And the reason is because examiners basically always say, this is, it raises new questions, I'd have to do new search, new consideration, something. They're not going to enter it, and then I have to file the RCE. So at one point I thought they were basically a waste of time. However, I have decided that they can be useful, and here's the reason why. So let's go to our trusty MPEP, and let's look up rejections of claims, and we're going to look up when they can potentially be made final. So final rejection, let's do RCE practice, because that's what we're talking about here. All right, MPEP. Section 706.07b, final rejection. So, if you have an application and you file an RCE where all the claims, they're either identical or patentably indistinct, or they would properly have been finally rejected on the grounds for the art of record, you can get a final rejection right after that RCE, which is awful. And I think you might even be, again, how much you trust the examiner, but if you just make some little amendment after an interview, maybe the examiner changes their mind. They say, this would have been properly finally rejected, and they can give you a final. But it would not be proper to make a first office action, a continuing, or an RCE where application contains material which was presented in the first one in an after final rejection, but it was denied entry because new issues were raised that would require further consideration and or search. So that thing, right, I send it in and the examiner says, oh, new issue, I have to do a search. If they say that, it's annoying, but it prevents you from having your first office action after the RCE final. So if you're going to file the RCE, and again, there are various reasons not to, but sometimes you do, I would at least consider submitting a after final response first. It's nice if you can get it through AFCP 2.0. Again, not always possible, but in general, if you do submit the after final response first, then you don't have to worry about running into this issue of getting a final rejection on the very next office action. So that's the first thing that I wanted to talk about, was the RCE. If you're going to file it, what is kind of a way of doing that? Next, so this is, I guess this is sort of a subset of abandonment, right? So you say this examiner is a nightmare and I hate them, or maybe they're just so slow. Oh my gosh, they're slow and we're waiting forever. We need a new examiner. Now, I think if you're looking for another pair of eyes, there's a really good way of doing it, and that's called an appeal. We're going to talk about appeals at the end. But let's say you don't want to go through an appeal. And there are various reasons you might not want to do that. It's longer, you have to write an appeal brief, expensive, etc. All right, so is it possible to get a new examiner? I have been asked this many times. The answer is yes, it is possible. Is there a reliable way to do it? Not that I have been able to find, but there are some things that I've seen in cases where I have gotten new examiners. So just briefly, why is this not particularly reliable? One, the Patent Office will generally keep related applications together. So, if it's a continuation, it will probably go to the same person because they're going to route it to the same person. Even if it's not, so for instance, let's say you do file a new application, somehow you don't have to worry about priority. If it's, the same invention, then you're probably going to go to the same art unit. It will, very likely, it might go to the same person. If not, then they may talk to each other, right? They've got, they interact. They've got the same supervisors, for example. So, they're institutionally, the Patent Office is not designed to give you control over who your examiner is. However, I've seen some cases where I have gotten cases put in with new examiners. So one is when I have filed a new application and I put it in track 1. So for instance, if you've got an examiner who is taking forever, I did have a case where I filed a follow-on application. It was a continuation in part, and it was under the track 1 program, and it was not given to the same examiner. It was given to a different examiner, same art group, but actually that examiner was a lot easier to work with. They were a lot faster, and we ended up getting the case through. And so track 1, filing, if your original one that you're having issues with is not track 1, filing a new application under the track 1 program, you may get a new examiner, even though, again, oftentimes they're going to be the same person. Also, I guess that case brings up another one that I've seen, and not always with track 1. Continuations in part is not necessarily going to be sent to the same examiner. Again, my expectation is most likely it will, but I've seen cases where it isn't. Also, another one, and so you do have the option of filing your priority claim after the date of filing, right? So you have a period after you file where you can submit the priority claim. So maybe you do a late priority claim. And I've actually seen cases where there are late priority claims also go to different examiners. Now again, do I say that, file a track 1 and a continuation in part and do a late priority claim and you're going to get a new examiner? No, I do not say that. And I also say that's not a great way of doing it because, again, if you really think, hey, what you need is a new pair of eyes, appeals are really, that's what it's designed for. And, I think it's better to go with the sort of standard approach rather than just rolling the dice on a new examiner. But it is possible. You can try doing a new examiner by doing a follow-on application and sort of filing it in a different way than the original one, whether that be putting it in track 1, making a continuation in part, having a late priority claim, what have you. You might be able to get a new examiner that way. Not reliable, but I have seen it, and I've been asked more than once in my career whether it's possible to get a new examiner. So you can try it if that's what you really are looking for. The final thing, though, and what I think is the most appropriate way of dealing with a final rejection is to appeal. Appeals really are what you're supposed to do, because you are supposed to have, at a final rejection, you should be at an impasse. And what do you do when you're at an impasse? You appeal it, right? You go to the next level. So I feel, to me, this just feels very right. And what I want to talk about right now is a little bit in terms of just the mechanics of the appeal. And this is something that I think it really gives you an advantage in an appeal that you don't have in the office action. So let me go to the appeal section of the MPEP. A thing that's annoying in your office actions, right? And I've had, I write this nice office action response, and the examiner is supposed to traverse everything in there, or at least answer all the arguments. And I've found in some cases they'll say, oh, and they just won't, or they'll lump everything together. They won't give it due consideration. It's very, very frustrating. That actually is one of the things I find that can lead to an appeal, is that you haven't really been able to communicate effectively during the prosecution process because your arguments are not being taken as seriously as you think they should. In the appeal brief, you can actually have a good deal of control over this. So what I've got up here, MPEP 1207.02, contents of the examiner's answer. So when you appeal, the examiner has to respond, and they have to say, here we're maintaining our rejections, and we restate the grounds of rejection. But they also have to respond to each of the arguments you make. And in addition to that, it doesn't just say they have to respond, because they should, again, this is something that should have happened in prosecution, but the examiner in the examiner's answer must use headings and subheadings paralleling the headings and subheadings used in the appellant's brief. And so one thing that I have found to be quite helpful when I'm writing my appeal briefs is to really think through the organization of it, so that I have headings and subheadings that when you are responding to my sections using my organization, or when the examiner is, I guess not you, but in any case, when the examiner is responding to my brief using my organization, it doesn't leave options, it doesn't leave available the option to just ignore or gloss something over. It has to be responded to on sort of a point-by-point basis. And do I say this necessarily wins you the appeal? Well, no, actually, because I think the appeal board does quite a good job in general with analyzing sort of the PTAB decisions, or with coming to their decisions. However, I think it really can help when you're getting to the examiner's answer. If they do something wrong, they may withdraw it more likely, or you can say, hey, now that you're responding to this, I've had cases where the examiners, when I read through the response, and I say, hey, you know what, now that you're really responding to it, you've actually shifted your ground of rejection, right? You're citing some new section of the art. You've never cited this before, which is technically a new ground of rejection. So if I want to, I can have prosecution reopened. I can reconsider the case, or I can reply to that, even if they haven't designated a new ground of rejection. I have the opportunity to then make new arguments in my response to the examiner's answer. And that's something that, again, if your organization isn't quite as on point, it doesn't bring things out quite as precisely, you wouldn't necessarily have that option. So what I would say, again, my preferred approach dealing with the final rejection really is appeal. And when I do it, I really think that hitting that organization, making sure your headings, subheadings are on point so that your arguments come out and everything has to be addressed as clearly as possible. So anyway, there you go. That is sort of ideally going to be the end of the prosecution process. I guess ideally you've ended it before then, but if you do get a final rejection, I think looking at maybe doing after final response rather than just filing an RCE, again, consider, but it's a little risky, but you might try and file like a follow-on application if you think the real problem is the examiner. And then my preferred and recommended approach is appeal, and doing it in a way that's very on point, very well organized, and will set you up very well once you get that examiner's answer. So good luck, good prosecution, and I will talk to you later. Bye-bye.